Good evening, dear students. I hope you are all doing well. Now, after having dealt with the first two parts of our lesson, mainly an introduction to relative clauses and relative pronouns, we are going to move to the third part, which will be about defining relative clauses versus non-defining relative clauses. Now, for those who haven't seen the first video, there is a link down this video where they can see the first two parts of the lesson. Well, let's proceed with the lesson. Now, I would like to refresh your mind about the term clause, even though we have already dealt with that in the previous lesson. What is a clause? Well, a clause is a group of words containing a subject and a verb which form a sentence or part of a sentence. Now, the second term I would like to talk about is a relative clause. So, what is a relative clause? A relative clause starts with a relative pronoun, either who, which, that, whose, where, when, whom, and why. Let's take this example here. The man who called you is my uncle. So the sentence here, who called you, is a relative clause. It gives us information about the man. So who refers back to the man. Now, let's see the differences between the two types of clauses, defining or non-defining relative clauses. Let's start with the first one, defining relative clauses. Now, a definition could be here. A defining relative clause gives necessary information and is essential to the meaning of the main sentence. So this is one. Number two, it usually comes immediately after the noun it describes and it can't be omitted. And if we do so, if we omit the relative clause, we will lose important information and the meaning will be not clear for the person you are talking to or writing to. So let's look at this example. The doctor who treated me is my brother. Now, so here, who treated me? This is the relative clause. And this relative clause is defining because it gives us necessary information about the doctor. So who refers back to the doctor, and if we omit or cross out this relative clause, we won't have a clear meaning. Maybe the person you are talking to will ask you, which doctor are you talking about? So here, if we say the doctor is my brother, so which doctor are we talking about? So who treated me is necessary information and essential information to the meaning of the sentence. Also, we said that it usually comes immediately after the noun it describes. So who treated me immediately comes after the doctor. So the doctor is the noun that it describes. Now, a second characteristic of defining a relative clause is that they are not put in commas. We don't have commas as you can see in this example. He is the actor who was killed in a car crash. There are no commas here, which is the case of non-defining relative clauses. They always have commas. Next, the relative pronoun can be omitted when it is the object of the relative clause. Let's see the example to make it clear. The man whom you spoke to is my boss. So we can say the man you spoke to is my boss. It's also correct. So we can omit or we can cross out this whom without affecting the meaning of the sentence. So here the relative pronoun, as we said, can be omitted when we are dealing with defining relative clauses. Another characteristic is that we can use the relative pronoun that instead of who, whom, or which with defining relative clause. So we can say the man that you spoke to is my boss, or we can substitute that with who. The man who or whom you spoke to is my boss. So that can be used here in defining relative clauses. Now let's move to the second type of relative clauses, which is non-defining relative clauses. A non-defining relative clause gives extra information. So notice here we have just extra. It's not essential. It's not necessary to the meaning. It is not essential to the meaning of the main sentence. It just adds more information. So it can be removed from the sentence without affecting the central meaning. Now let's see an example. Example: my brother who lives in Rabat is a doctor. Now imagine here, if we omit or cross out this relative clause, who lives in Rabat, what do we get? We get my brother is a doctor, which is meaningful and clear. But if we add here, we are just given extra information. My brother who lives in Rabat is a doctor. So the second characteristic, as you may have noticed here, is the commas. A non-defining relative clause is put in commas. Example: John, who is very lazy, failed his test again. So John, if we say John failed his test again, it makes sense. Now here we are using who is very lazy as an extra information, and here we are using commas, as you may have noticed. So commas are essential in non-defining relative clauses. In non-defining relative clauses, the relative pronoun cannot be omitted, and this is really important here. So it means we cannot say John is very lazy, failed his test again. So we should say John, who is very lazy, failed the test again. Okay, so here, who is very lazy, who cannot be omitted. The relative pronoun cannot be omitted in non-defining relative clauses. And finally, we cannot use the relative pronoun that with non-defining relative clauses. That cannot be used. It could be used with defining relative clause, but not with non-defining relative clauses. So this is an example. John, that is very lazy, failed the test. It's not correct. We should say John, who is very lazy, failed the test. Well, here there is a chart that explains more about defining relative clauses. We have as a subject, an object, and possessive case. We have people and things. You can go into this chart and learn more about the usage of defining relative clauses. This is concerning non-defining relative clauses. As you can see, the same thing. We have people, we have things, we have subject, object, and possessive case. Now, let's recapitulate what we have seen here. So the differences, the main difference between defining relative clauses and non-defining relative clauses. So the first difference is that defining relative clauses add essential information, necessary information, whereas non-defining relative clauses, the information they convey is not essential, or it is just extra information. The second difference is that defining relative clauses are not set off by commas. It means we don't use commas with them. And for non-defining relative clauses, the commas are essential and necessary part of the sentence or the clause. The third difference is that the relative pronoun can be omitted when it is an object. We can omit or we can cross out the relative pronoun when it is an object, but it's not the case for non-defining relative clauses. The relative pronoun could never be omitted. And the fourth and last difference is that the relative pronoun that can replace who, which, and whom, whereas in the non-defining relative clause it cannot be used. Well, that's all, guys. I hope you have understood what I have trying to convey to you. Thank you for your attention and see you in another video.